Eric Newmark, thank you so much for taking time to talk to me. Just a few words about Eric Newmark. He is an attorney based in the Twin Cities. He's worked there for several years. He is a good person to talk to right now for several reasons. Could you give us a sense of what's happening in Minneapolis? Because, I've been to Minneapolis. I'm from Minneapolis. You live just outside of Minneapolis. For people who are not there, it's hard to fully comprehend what's happening in the city right now. So if you could give us a sense of what's happening in the city and then help us understand how that meshes with, what traditionally should be the legal framework
Yeah.
around, this kind of immigration enforcement action.
Yeah, so what I had seen previously with these operations, whether there was National Guard that Trump had called in, were sort of block by block, like kind of small areas. What we're seeing in Minneapolis is essentially our entire city and the Twin Cities under siege, under occupation. There are militarized ICE agents on wide swaths of the city. They're going into restaurants, they're going into businesses, they are essentially harassing people. They are starting confrontations with observers. It's not an exaggeration to say that we feel and we are under siege at this point. I heard that we now have more federal law enforcement officers than we have complete police officers in the 10 biggest police departments in the state, excuse
Combined.
me,
Combined.
combined.
Mhm.
Less than 2,000 police officers, more than 3,000 ICE agents. And so I guess I want your listeners to get an understanding. We are under siege. We are essentially being attacked and occupied by our own government, and it's terrifying. And it's really hard when you look at the images that kind of appear in small areas or on specific blocks to understand that this is happening throughout the city every day.
So someone might hear that and think, well, that sounds a bit hyperbolic. Under siege, living under an occupation. When you say living under siege, what do you mean by that? That these are federal forces that don't answer to local authorities, that people are living in fear? What would lead you, as a lawyer who uses language very carefully, to make a statement like that?
Yeah. The reason why I say that is not only the way they're acting, but the way the administration is essentially saying that they can act. I heard yesterday or the day before, JD Vance says that they have absolute immunity, and they seem to be acting with that understanding. They are starting confrontations. They are displaying firearms. They're dressed in military gear. It's not hyperbole to say that we feel not only are we under siege from our federal government, but there's really nothing to protect us. Obviously, the administration is not going to come in and protect us. It's very difficult for local law enforcement to really even understand what they're supposed to be doing in this situation. Businesses are closing, schools are closing, restaurants are closing. People are afraid to go outside, and it's not hyperbole to say that it's not just a dangerous situation for our immigrant community; it's a dangerous situation for our entire community.
Yeah, they're now are approaching, questioning, in some cases apprehending, not just people who are thought to be in the country illegally, but people who are following them, who are trying to document their actions. We'll come back to that as well. But this word, absolute immunity, is there such a thing as absolute immunity for a law enforcement agent?
There, there is not. There is not absolute immunity for law enforcement. Law enforcement is obligated to follow the law. They're required to follow the Constitution, and just like anybody else, if they fail to follow the law, they're subject to the same laws and penalties that any other citizen would. There's no such thing as absolute immunity. I was flabbergasted to hear any administration official essentially tell ICE officers that they have absolute immunity to act however they want to in any situation in any way possible.
In law, precedent is important. Is there a precedent for anyone, any organization, any law enforcement entity getting um, receiving
Well,
absolute immunity? Is it
in the
something we've
civil
seen before?
in the civil rights arena, there's something called qualified immunity, where you're immune from civil lawsuits in certain situations. But there's no absolute immunity for law enforcement or anybody else to act however they want to without fear of any consequences. They're subject to following the Constitution. They're subject to following the laws of the state of Minnesota while they're in the state of Minnesota.
Who would qualify for qualified immunity?
Well, there's certain times that officers, in terms of civil liability, if they're acting within the scope of their employment, have immunity from civil lawsuits if they can demonstrate that they're what they were doing was essentially part of their a legitimate part of their law enforcement duties. But there's no such thing as absolute immunity for criminal violations or civil violations if the police are acting outside of the scope. And we had obviously many examples in Minnesota in the last 5 years. Derek Chauvin among those other ones who claimed that they were acting under color of law and following their training and doing things correctly, but Minnesota fairly and justly was able to prosecute him and prove that he was acting well beyond his scope and committed murder, and he's in prison now.
Derek Chauvin being the police officer who kept his knee on George Floyd's neck, was tried. The police chief at that time actually testified at trial, which is quite unusual. In some ways, the killing of Renee Nicole Good at 34th and Portland Avenue is a tragedy that is adjacent to an irony that is wrapped up in a series of atrocities. The tragedy, of course, is her death. And now what we're seeing in the city and the reaction. The irony is that it happened 6 years and 6 blocks away from where George Floyd was murdered. And that we're seeing a level of policing that feels like it appears to be blind to the reforms that flowed out of the George Floyd case, where this kicked off a real, a robust conversation and debate about police reform and police conduct. And the atrocities are the number of people who have been swept up, who are citizens, who are exercising their First Amendment rights. So let's just, tick through some of those, starting with the irony of this happening so close to George Floyd and the policing that people had come to expect and the trust that the police department locally had started to win back, from the public after that tragedy.
Well, and there was a consent decree that took a long time in the aftermath of George Floyd for the federal government and the Minneapolis police to agree on certain reforms and other things that they required to do. It's my understanding that the current White House has thrown that off and it's no longer valid, which is, like everything else that happened during the George Floyd period, there was a lot of momentum towards better policing, towards better procedures, towards better training, and that's essentially been thrown out the window. And that was local law enforcement. But one thing I wanted to add about what you were saying about the tragedy and everything is when something like this happens, we expect our leaders and our president to comfort, to be there, to heal, to not to jump to conclusions or jump to lies and say that she was a domestic terrorist or say that she was, somehow caused this or was responsible for her own death. We would expect any leader to say this is a tragedy. We reach out, we feel sympathy for the family, for the community, and in fact, they've taken the opposite stance, which is also part of the reason why, as Minnesotans, we feel under siege. We don't feel protected by the federal government. We feel attacked by the federal government, and it's shocking to me that they would take that tact instead of at least being neutral and saying, "We'll let the investigation play out." They took the offensive. They blamed her. They called her a terrorist. I haven't heard one expression of sympathy for her wife, for her family, her 6-year-old son, or for the community for what happened. And it's appalling. And when you ask why we feel under siege, that's part of it. Not only the actions, but the words of this administration. They're not here for us. They're here to harm us.
When you talk to law enforcement officials, and I've spent some time talking to some of them in Minnesota who are part of the local law enforcement apparatus, they talk about the importance of guardrails, the importance of messaging to toward the people that you're sending, the men and women that you're sending out on the street to protect and to serve. That is their mission, to serve and protect, who have guns, who have extreme authority. What I'm told is it's very important to help them understand the limits of that authority and the way that authority should be used and should not be used to make sure that you're protecting not just the people of Minnesota, but also the reputation of the department, and the trust that you build with the community that you serve. And that, seems to rub up against this idea that you have complete immunity.
Right. And we're talking now about the distinction between this federal law enforcement operation, for lack of a better word, that's occurring. And I agree that the local police, Minneapolis police and other agencies have done things in an attempt to fix the problems that we were seeing, and try to be better with community policing and engage with the public. And we are not seeing any of that now. I mean, as you know, Michelle, not only did we have George Floyd, but we also had Dante Wright up
Right.
in a suburb who was shot and killed by a police officer who also was tried in state court because she didn't have immunity and went to prison as well. And so we're still reeling and trying to reckon with all of those things that happened.
Oh, and Philando Castile in Falcon Heights, and yes.
Is Philando before that, right? And so, and there's just been a number of them. There was Winston Smith,
Mhm.
who was murdered in South Minneapolis and shot by law enforcement who, as far as I know, was never even named. So we had a lot of concern and fear and distrust between the community and law enforcement. And I think there were some efforts to try to heal that and try to have police do a better job as community members and police officers rather than sort of us versus them. And all of that's been thrown away in the last few weeks, at least with this as it relates to these federal agents.
Well, the us versus them, the that sort of question could be applied to local law enforcement and the federal agents that are in the city. I mean, you see a really interesting juxtaposition, even in the optics. So you have federal officials, it's interesting how their uniforms have changed, how their protocols have changed. There have been Border Patrol agents and ICE agents that have worn tactical gear for some time in certain situations, particularly along the border, the southern border. You haven't necessarily seen that in American cities. Um, how concerned are you about the use of tactical gear, both the uniforms that they wear, also the weapons that they carry, the tear gas, the pepper pellets? There's a question about the gas that they used earlier this week when someone was shot on the north side of the city. I'm going to be careful about stating this because some people were saying that it wasn't actually tear gas, that it was HC gas, which is thought to be a carcinogen. We don't know that, but there are questions about that now. So I'm just interested in your thoughts as someone who is, as a lawyer, uh, what you think about the use of tactical gear in whether that is sends a message of protection or provocation.
Yeah, these optics are not intended to make us feel safe. These optics are intended to scare us, and they've had they in some ways they've had that effect. It's shocking, and I hope your listeners and viewers can, when they look at those images, to understand we're an American city. We're a large metropolis, and we are by and large a peaceful city, despite what our claims are being made by the administration. And to have federal agents, looking like, what you would see in the Middle East, people roaming the streets with weapons and tactical gear and camouflage type of outfits. It's terrifying. It doesn't look like any law enforcement that we've seen, and it doesn't look like any law enforcement we would trust. And it's not an accident that this is an intentional act on the administration's part to make us feel that we're under siege. And I'm not sure what we did to get in Donald Trump's uh, gun sights. I don't know whether it was our Somali community, whether it was Governor Walz running for vice president, whether it was our Minneapolis Congresswoman Omar. I don't know what exactly set him off, but this is not an accident. This is intended to send a message to us, and frankly, to send a message to the rest of the United States that if you don't agree with us, if your position is different than ours, this is what's going to happen to you. I mean, it's a juxtaposition between the January 6ers, who I understand we're expecting to host in our city this weekend, who also clearly were attacking police officers with flagpoles. And as long as you're with the president, you get a pardon. If you're against the president, no matter how peaceful you are, you get an armed militia in your city.
They would challenge the notion that this is a militia. They would say that they actually are not militia. Militia is extrajudicial. They work outside the government. In this case, they would say that they're actually working for the federal government.
Yeah, and maybe my language is a little sloppy, but we feel that we are under, in some ways, an occupation, a military occupation. And Trump is champing at the bit to send the military in. I mean, he's begging for a confrontation. He's begging for any reason to bring in the military. And I think that Minneapolis is the test zone for that, to see how the country and how Minneapolis will react when we have United States military roaming our streets, which I think is honestly the next step here.